At 8:15 a.m., August 6, 1945, the sun rose twice over Hiroshima. Dr. Emiko Tanaka, 29, petite, porcelain-skinned, beneath her gray smock, wipes sweat from her brow as she tends to a soldier with a fever. The morning air is thick with summer cicadas and the far-off drone of aircraft that people in Hiroshima have grown used to. "Probably reconnaissance," says Nurse Haruka, rolling her eyes. Emiko glances up. 3 silhouettes glimmer against the bright blue. One veers east. The other continues straight. They'd learned to read the sky, but that morning, even the veterans of air raids couldn't read the color of the light. She notes the time on her clipboard. 8:14 a.m. Then, a blinding flash, white, purer than lightning, hotter than the sun. The sound follows half a breath later, an impossible boom that folds the world in on itself. Emiko's world turns to fire. The walls liquefy. Glass becomes dust. She's thrown across the ward, her ears screaming. When she opens her eyes, the roof is gone and the soldier's bed is empty. She staggers into what used to be the courtyard. The air burns. Shadows of people are seared into the pavement. A mother holds a child who isn't moving. A man's skin hangs from his arms like molten cloth. Hiroshima had vanished, but its echoes would take hours to reach Tokyo. Lieutenant Sato, 23, thin-faced, uniform perfectly pressed, rushes through the corridor of the General Staff Building, clutching a decoded telegram. He bows deeply before General Hideki Anzai, 54, the Command-in-Chief of Imperial Army Operations, a man whose stare could slice steel. "Sir, we've lost communication with the Western Chugoku Region Command. Reports of a massive explosion over Hiroshima. Radio silence from the 2nd General Army." Anzai doesn't look up from his map. "Sabotage? A fuel depot?" "Unknown, sir. Witnesses describe a single aircraft, then a light brighter than the sun." Anzai's pen stops. "Brighter than the sun?" he repeats quietly. "Poetic nonsense. Resume communication by noon." Sato bows again. "Hi, General." The old man's hand trembles slightly, but he hides it behind his sleeve. The War Council gathers. Cigarette smoke clouds the air. General Anzai, Foreign Minister Togo, Navy Minister Yonai, and Prime Minister Suzuki stand before the Emperor's empty chair. "Tokyo intelligence reports a new type of bomb," says Togo. "The Americans claim to have harnessed atomic energy." "Propaganda," Anzai snaps. "A city cannot vanish from one bomb." A radio operator interrupts. "Sir, incoming transmission from Osaka, Hiroshima is completely destroyed. No contact with the Army headquarters." The room falls silent. Yonai whispers, "Destroyed? As in what? Flattened?" The operator hesitates. "No, sir. There's nothing left to flatten." Hours later, Emiko crawls through rubble that was once the Shima Hospital. Her hair is singed, her lips cracked. The river glows red with bodies. She ties a strip of her torn smock around a boy's arm. He's 12, eyes glazed. "It hurts, Sensei." "I know," she whispers, though she has no medicine, no water, no hope. Above them, the sky rains black ash. Voiceover. In Tokyo, they argued whether this was science or myth. In Hiroshima, myth had turned to hell. Evening of August 6th. Anzai stands at the radio desk, headset pressed to his ear. Static voices, then a fragment from the Army Field Hospital in Ujina. "This is Lieutenant Okabe. The city. Gone. Everyone burned. We cannot find headquarters. Please send. One in headquarters. Please send. Letter." Transmission ends. The general removes his headset slowly. He turns to the council. His voice is gravel. "Gentlemen, Hiroshima no longer exists." For a moment, no one breathes. Prime Minister Suzuki mutters, "Impossible." Anzai slams his fist on the table. "Do you think I'd misreport a ghost city? We have awakened a new era of warfare, and we are the experiment." A young officer crosses himself quietly, a Catholic. "Forbidden, but forgiven in fear." A servant kneels before Emperor Hirohito, delivering the telegram. He reads it silently, then places it beside a bowl of orchids. His voice barely above a whisper. So, the gods have abandoned us. Aboard the Enola Gay, pilot Paul Tibbets writes in his log, "Mission successful. Target destroyed." Behind him, co-pilot Robert Lewis mutters to himself, "I pray God forgives us for what we've done today." One city was gone. One nation still denied it. Lieutenant Sato walks home through a darkened street, lanterns dimmed. He sees children playing war in the dust, shouting bonsai at imaginary enemies. He stops, watching them, then looks up at the black sky. How do you fight a weapon you cannot see? He asks no one. In the war room, a telegram operator rushes in. New message from Washington. The Americans demand immediate surrender or expect a second bomb. The camera pulls tight on General Anzai's face. He whispers, "If this is true, then the Empire has already died." The air inside the underground War Council chamber was as heavy as the stones that lined its walls. Smoke hung low, a thick gray haze that turned every man into a shadow of himself. General Hideki Anzai sat at the far end of the long, polished table, a single lamp glowing above him like an interrogation light. His uniform was spotless, but his eyes looked as though he hadn't slept for years. Around him, the most powerful men in Japan waited for him to speak, or perhaps prayed that he wouldn't. No one dared break the silence that followed the last telegram. The operator had placed it on the table as if it were a cursed relic. Second bomb, if no surrender. The words were still echoing in every man's head. Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki's hands trembled as he reached for his teacup, but the tea had long gone cold. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai leaned forward, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Hideki, this message, is it authentic?" Anzai's jaw tightened. "Yes, cross-checked twice by the Communications Bureau. The Americans transmitted it openly on a frequency used for diplomatic warnings. They want us to hear it." "Then Hiroshima truly is gone?" Suzuki's question sounded more like a plea for denial than a request for confirmation. Anzai nodded once. "Flattened. Our scouts from Kure reached the outskirts at dawn. Nothing stands. Those who entered the ruins did not return. Radiation, they call it." The last word fell strange from his lips, a word from Western science, one no Japanese officer had ever used in war before. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo rubbed his temples. "They have achieved the impossible. One bomb, one city. Gentlemen, if they possess more," interrupted War Minister Korechika Anami, "then our empire is already finished." He struck the table with his fist, sending a cup toppling. "And yet, we cannot surrender. To do so would betray the spirits of those who died for the emperor." The room stirred. Every man knew Anami's loyalty was absolute. He would fight to the last breath. But even his voice carried a tremor. Now the tremor of a man who had seen the edge of the world. Lieutenant Sato stood near the door, still in his boots from the field. He had been ordered to remain for record-keeping, but he felt like an intruder in a chamber of ghosts. Sweat trickled down his back as he watched his superiors argue about the fate of millions. Togo rose slowly, adjusting his spectacles. "War Minister, loyalty is not blind suicide. If this bomb is truly atomic, as the Americans claim, no fortress, no mountain, no fleet will protect us. A single plane could erase Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, even this palace." Anzai lifted his eyes at that. "Enough." His voice was low, the tone of a man used to commanding obedience. "The Emperor must not hear panic. Until we confirm the Americans' capability, the Empire stands ready to fight." "But sir," Sato blurted, forgetting his place, "what if they drop another one before we confirm it?" Every head turned. The young lieutenant froze, his heart hammered in his chest. He expected a slap or a barked order to leave. Instead, Anzai stared at him, expression unreadable. "Young man," the general said at last. In war, we confirm by dying. Until the next bomb falls, our duty is to doubt. Sato bowed deeply, throat burning with shame, but he noticed the flicker in Anzai's eyes, the brief, unguarded fear of a soldier who knew doubt had already taken root. Far away, the sound of distant sirens drifted through the ventilation shaft. Tokyo had grown used to false alarms, but now even the harmless wail made everyone's spine tighten. The war had come home long ago, but this was different. No bunker could save them from a sun that exploded from the sky. Hours passed. Messages came and went. None brought comfort. Reports from Hiroshima multiplied descriptions so unbelievable they felt like madness. People without faces, streets on fire without fuel, shadows burned into walls. The operators read them aloud until their voices shook. By nightfall, the council chamber had turned into a tomb of whispering men. General Anzai finally stood. Enough discussion. The Emperor will be briefed at dawn. We cannot let him see division among us. Prepare the statement, our position is unchanged. We will continue the war. Togo stared at him, aghast. Continue? With what? We have no oil, no air force capable of defending the cities. And now, silence. Anzai's voice cracked like a whip. We speak of duty, not probability. The room fell quiet again, but the silence no longer carried discipline. It carried despair. After the meeting dissolved, Anzai walked alone through the dim corridor toward his private office. The lights flickered from the fuel shortage. When he reached his desk, he opened the drawer and pulled out a photograph of his son, Akira, in flight uniform, smiling beside a Zero fighter. The boy had volunteered for a kamikaze mission 2 months ago. His plane never returned. Anzai placed the photograph on the desk and stared at it until his vision blurred. Was your sacrifice enough, Akira? He whispered. Or did we die for an illusion? A soft knock on the door. Lieutenant Sato entered, hesitant. Sir, may I speak freely? Anzai gestured without looking up. You already have, once. Sato stepped closer. Sir, I saw Hiroshima before the war. I studied there. If it's truly gone, we must tell the people the truth. The truth? Anzai laughed quietly, a sound without humor. The truth will destroy the empire faster than any bomb. Do you think our people can bear to know their gods have fallen? Sato swallowed. Then perhaps it is time we stopped asking gods to fight our wars. For a long moment, Anzai said nothing. The young man's words hung in the air, dangerous and pure. Then the general turned away. Go home, Lieutenant. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow we serve His Majesty. Leave philosophy to priests. Sato bowed and left. Outside, he breathed the night air thick with humidity and fear. The streets of Tokyo were dark, rationed, but life continued, mothers queuing for rice, soldiers guarding empty stations, children dragging wooden toys shaped like planes. The illusion of normalcy wrapped the city like gauze over a wound that would not heal. In a small temple near the river, monks chanted sutras for the dead of Hiroshima. Their voices carried faintly through the night, a rhythm older than any empire. Sato stopped to listen. He wondered how many names they would need to recite. Far away, at Ujina Bay, Dr. Emiko Tanaka stood beside the remains of the military pier. The sun had set hours ago, but the horizon still glowed faintly orange from the endless fires. Her hands were bandaged, her face streaked with ash. She had found only one other doctor alive. Together they tended to hundreds who lay moaning in the mud. She had stopped counting the dead. She knelt beside a young girl with half-burned hair. The child whispered, "Sensei, will it rain soon?" "Yes," Emiko said softly, though the sky was clear. "Rain will come. You'll be cool again." She looked up. The stars were dim behind the haze, but one shone brighter, or perhaps it was another aircraft. Her stomach twisted. She no longer trusted the sky. At dawn on August 7th, the War Council reconvened. Emperor Hirohito attended in person this time, seated behind a folding screen. The officers bowed until their foreheads nearly touched the floor. Anzai presented his report without emotion. Your Majesty, preliminary assessment confirms Hiroshima suffered catastrophic damage due to an enemy bomb of unprecedented power. Civilian and military casualties estimated, total. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Behind the screen, the Emperor's voice came, soft but clear. What weapon can erase a city? Togo answered, A bomb born from the splitting of atoms, Majesty. It releases the energy of creation itself. Creation. The Emperor repeated the word as though tasting it. Then mankind has stolen the thunder of heaven. No one replied. The silence was its own confession. Finally, Hirohito spoke again. You will find a way to protect what remains, and you will prepare the nation for peace. The words hung in the air like a forbidden melody. Peace. No one had expected to hear it spoken aloud. Even Anzai's posture faltered. But before anyone could speak, the Emperor rose and left the chamber, his attendants following silently. The generals stared at each other. To defy an order directly spoken by the Emperor was treason. To obey, it was surrender. The room seemed to tilt under the weight of that choice. After the meeting, Anzai walked the garden path that wound behind the palace. The morning air smelled of pine and ashes. He remembered when the garden had been bright with chrysanthemums. Now the flowers were wilted from neglect. A cicada droned somewhere above, relentless, oblivious. He was joined by Anami, the war minister, his face carved from stone. You heard His Majesty, Anzai said quietly. He speaks of peace. Anami's reply came through clenched teeth. Peace born from humiliation is not peace. I will never sign surrender papers. Then what will you do? Fight. Die. Anzai looked at him. And the civilians? The children? Shall they die as warriors too? Anami's silence was answer enough. He bowed curtly and walked away, leaving Anzai alone beneath the dying trees. That evening, Sato was ordered to deliver classified communiques to the army ministry. On his way through the compound, he overheard officers whispering. Reports from Nagasaki suggested American planes were concentrating there. The words chilled him. Another city, another sun. He delivered the files, saluted, and stepped outside into the courtyard. The sky was strangely beautiful, streaked red and gold, and for a moment he wondered if Hiroshima's dawn had looked the same before the light consumed it. In his small room that night, he wrote in his journal, If the gods remain silent after this, then perhaps they were never gods at all. Back in the palace, General Anzai couldn't sleep. He poured sake into a cup, stared at it, and left it untouched. On his desk lay the Emperor's order for preparations toward peace, unsigned by the War Ministry. He knew Anami would stall, claiming honor, tradition, Bushido. But honor could not rebuild ash into houses. Near midnight, a knock on his door. It was Sato again, pale and nervous. Forgive me, sir. I know it's late. I just received a coded message from the radio station in Kyushu. They report sighting of American bombers heading north. Anzai's heart lurched. How many? 3, maybe 4, at high altitude. The general looked toward the window where Tokyo's skyline shimmered faintly in moonlight. It may be reconnaissance again. Yes, sir, Sato said softly, though both men knew reconnaissance had become a ghost word. Anzai dismissed him, then sat down, exhaustion pressing on his shoulders. The clock ticked toward morning. He thought of his son again, of the Emperor's calm voice, of the whisper that peace might still be possible if they yielded. But yielding was something his generation had never been taught. They were forged to obey, to endure, to die, never to surrender. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he imagined Hiroshima. Before the blast, the river bridges, the paper lanterns floating during summer festivals, the laughter of students, all of it gone, like breath on glass. He whispered the city's name, as though by speaking it, he could summon it back. At dawn, the telephones rang again. Another city had been erased. The bomb over Nagasaki fell at 11:02 a.m. By noon, Anzai stood in the War Council room, reading the fresh report. His face was gray, his hands trembling. Around him, no one spoke. There was nothing left to argue. The commander-in-chief of the Japanese army looked up at the others men who had ruled an empire and said the words that would mark the end of an age. "Gentlemen, our swords are made of paper." The sentence hung in the air, final and unforgiving. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain, the first rain after Hiroshima. The corridors of the imperial palace were quiet that morning, quiet in a way that felt unnatural for a place where the fate of millions was being weighed. Even the cicadas seemed muted, as if the sound of two vanished cities had silenced the insects themselves. Emperor Hirohito stood by the narrow window of his private study, gazing across the gardens where the koi pond still reflected the sky. He had not slept since the report of Nagasaki arrived. The reflection in the water looked older than the man he was. His eyes carried the burden of both a ruler and a god whose people were perishing in his name. His chamberlain, old and stooped, approached softly. "Your Majesty, the War Council awaits your word." Hirohito nodded without turning. How does a man speak when his voice can end a nation? The chamberlain bowed. "Perhaps by remembering that silence will end it sooner." Outside, the council room simmered with tension. General Hideki Anzai sat at the table again, a ghost among men. He had spent the night rereading the reports from Nagasaki eyewitness accounts of flesh melting like wax, shadows fused into stone, rivers boiling. Each report was dated the same way, the 9th of August, 1945, the day the sun became death. War Minister Anami entered last, his boots echoing against the marble floor. His uniform was immaculate, his expression carved in defiance. "Gentlemen," he began, "we have suffered another tragedy. But it only proves that surrender will bring nothing but shame. The Americans will not stop until the Emperor himself is humiliated. Better we perish as warriors than live as slaves." Togo, the foreign minister, slammed his palm on the table. "Slaves? Do you think the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki care for your samurai pride? You speak of honor, but what honor remains when children die before they can even pronounce the word?" Anami's eyes flared. "Watch your tongue, minister. Words like yours are why our soldiers question resolve." "Resolve?" Togo shot back. "Resolve cannot rebuild a world of ghosts." The shouting rose until Anzai's voice cut through it. "Enough! We stand before extinction and argue about semantics." He looked from one man to another. "Our intelligence warns that the Americans have more of these weapons. 10, perhaps 20. If even half of that is true, there will be no Japan left to defend." The room fell quiet again. Each man knew the truth, knew it, but could not speak it. Their empire was broken. Yet to admit it aloud was to unmake themselves. Then the chamberlain appeared at the doorway. "His Majesty will see you now." The men stood as the emperor entered, pale in his white uniform. His presence still commanded reverence, though everyone knew the illusion of divinity was collapsing with the empire. He seated himself slowly, eyes calm, voice soft. "I have read your reports," he said. "Tell me, how many of our people remain?" "Approximately 60 million, Your Majesty," Togo answered. "And how many must die before this war is considered honorable?" No one replied. The question was not rhetorical, it was surgical, cutting straight through years of pride. Hirohito looked at Anzai. "General, you are a soldier. You have served me since before this war began. Tell me, truly, can we still fight?" Anzai hesitated, his throat tight. He thought of his son, of the ash that used to be Hiroshima. "No, Majesty," he said finally. "We have swords, but the enemy has sons." The emperor's gaze shifted to Anami. "And you? War Minister?" Anami's jaw clenched. "I will fight as long as there is breath in my body." Hirohito's tone did not change. "And when there is none left?" Shall the children take up the sword for you? Anami's lips trembled, but he bowed low. Your Majesty, if it is your will to seek peace, I will obey. But understand, many will not. There are men who would die rather than hear the word surrender. Then they will die for nothing, the Emperor said quietly. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over Tokyo. The men glanced upward instinctively, fearing another American bomber, but it was only a summer storm. The Emperor rose and stepped toward the window, his silhouette framed against the light. The world changes, he said, almost to himself. Once we believed the Emperor's spirit protected this land. Now the sky itself strikes us down. Perhaps the divine have chosen another people. The generals shifted uneasily. Hearing such words from a man considered semi-divine unsettled even the loyal. Hirohito turned. I will speak to the people myself. They must hear from their emperor, not their generals. Prepare a recording. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Never in the history of Japan had the emperor addressed the common people directly. Anzai bowed deeply. As you command, Majesty. When he looked up, Hirohito had already left the room. That night, Tokyo drowned in rain. The storm lashed the city, washing soot from rooftops, but could not cleanse the dread that gripped its people. In a narrow barracks on the edge of the palace compound, Lieutenant Sato sat cleaning his pistol by candlelight. He had been assigned to security for the upcoming imperial recording. Around him, other officers murmured anxiously. You really think His Majesty will surrender? One asked. He must, another replied. Even the gods cannot fight the Americans' bomb. A third snorted. Speak for yourself. The war minister will never allow it. They say he's already meeting with the imperial guards. Sato looked up. What do you mean? Rumor is, some officers plan to stop the broadcast. They'll seize the palace if they must. They think surrender is treason. Sato's hand froze around the pistol. He had seen the madness in men's eyes before battle. But this was worse, a desperation born not of courage, but of fear of irrelevance. In another wing of the palace, Anzai met privately with Anami. Rain beat against the windows, drowning their voices. War Minister, Anzai said, you must control your men. If they act against the emperor, Japan will destroy itself from within. Anami poured sake into 2 cups, pushing one toward him. You misunderstand me, old friend. I will not raise my hand against His Majesty. But if others act, I will not stop them either. Anzai stared. That is cowardice. Anami's smile was sad. No, that is acceptance. The war has already ended. We are merely deciding how we die. He stood and left, the door closing like a coffin lid behind him. By midnight, thunder had faded into steady rain. The palace slept uneasily. But in the shadows beyond its walls, a group of officers moved silently. Led by Major Kenji Hatanaka, a man young enough to believe glory could still be salvaged. He carried orders forged in Anami's name, commanding the imperial guards to secure the palace for His Majesty's safety. Sato was on duty when they arrived. He recognized Hatanaka from the War Ministry. The major's eyes gleamed with conviction. Lieutenant, Hatanaka said briskly, by order of the War Minister, the palace is now under protective lockdown. No one enters or leaves. Sato's instinct screamed. Protective? From what? From traitors who would disgrace the empire by surrendering. The words hit like gunfire. Sato knew instantly what this was, a coup wrapped in patriotism. The emperor commands the broadcast tomorrow, he said carefully. Interfering would save Japan's honor, Hatanaka interrupted. Stand aside. Sato hesitated. The corridor was narrow, his men outnumbered 2 to 1. Slowly, he stepped back, letting them pass, but his mind was racing. He waited until they disappeared around the corner, then slipped away toward Anzai's quarters. He found the general still awake, writing in a small notebook. Sir, the guards have moved. Hatanaka leads them. They mean to stop the emperor's message. Anzai's pen froze. Then it begins. He rose, holstering his sidearm. We must protect His Majesty. Gather the loyal men. Sato nodded and ran. In the dim corridors of the palace, echoes of boots and whispered commands filled the air. The coup was unfolding like a ghostly dance, doors barred, telephones cut, guards confused by conflicting orders. In the recording room, technicians huddled around the microphone, unaware that rebels were already closing in. Anzai and Sato reached them just as Hatanaka's men entered the outer courtyard. The general turned to his aide. "You must hide the recording when it's done. Even if I fall, ensure it reaches the radio station." "Sir, you can't face them alone. I've faced worse than boys with misplaced valor. Go." Sato obeyed. He slipped into the recording chamber just as the emperor arrived, flanked by a small entourage. Hirohito looked composed, though his eyes carried deep sorrow. The technicians bowed low, trembling. He took his place before the microphone. The glass tubes glowed softly. For a moment, only the rain outside spoke. Then his voice began measured, calm, eternal. "To our good and loyal subjects, after pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure." The men in the room bowed lower, tears streaming down their faces. The emperor continued, each word a blade cutting through centuries of pride. "We have ordered the government to communicate to the governments of the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union that our empire accepts their provisions." At that very moment, Hatanaka burst through the outer doors. Gunfire crackled down the hallway. Anzai stood firm at the entrance, revolver raised. "Major," he called, "stand down. The emperor's will is sacred." "Sacred?" Hatanaka shouted back. "The emperor is being deceived. You've turned him into a puppet of the Americans." Anzai fired a warning shot into the ceiling. "No more lies. The war is over." But Hatanaka's men surged forward. The corridor exploded into chaos, shouts, gunfire, the metallic clang of boots on marble. Anzai fired again, hitting one soldier, then another. A bullet grazed his arm, spinning him against the wall. Sato heard the shots as the emperor finished speaking. The final words echoed through the chamber. "Endure the unendurable, bear the unbearable, and thereby bring peace to the nation." The recording clicked off. Sato snatched the reel from the technician's hands and hid it beneath his jacket. Outside, the fighting intensified. He ran through side corridors, heart pounding, clutching the reel as though it were the soul of Japan itself. Bodies lay in the halls, loyalists and rebels alike. Thunder rolled again, this time real, shaking the palace windows. At last he reached the northern gate, where loyal guards waited. "Take this to NHK radio," he gasped, pressing the reel into their hands. "If we fail here, the world must still hear His Majesty." They nodded and vanished into the rain. Back inside, Anzai lay wounded near the council room, blood soaking his sleeve. Hatanaka stood over him, breathing hard, pistol raised. "You betrayed the empire," the major hissed. Anzai looked up, pain flickering into pity. "No, Major. I saved it from men who would burn it twice." Before Hatanaka could reply, another shot rang out from behind. The major fell, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. Sato lowered his smoking pistol, trembling. "Sir," he whispered, kneeling beside the general. "The recording, it's safe." Anzai smiled faintly, eyes dimming. "Then Japan will live. Perhaps not in glory, but in memory." He exhaled once, softly, and was still. Outside, the rain began to ease. Somewhere across Tokyo, the radio engineers prepared the broadcast that would end the war. When the emperor's voice finally reached the nation on August 15th, men wept in the streets, soldiers threw down their rifles, and mothers held their children as though touching the future. In the ruins of Hiroshima, Dr. Emiko Tanaka heard the faint crackle of a surviving radio. The words were distorted, but she understood. She sank to her knees, tears mixing with the ash. "It is over," she whispered. Maybe now the dead can rest. Above her, the sky was clear, for the first time in days. And somewhere in that silence, the ghosts of two cities drifted toward the dawn. The morning of the 15th of August, 1945, broke with a pale, trembling light over Tokyo. It was neither dawn nor day. It was something in between, like the breath between life and death. In streets still damp from the night's rain, people gathered around shop-front radios, their faces gray and hollow. Vendors abandoned their stalls. Trams stopped mid-track. The entire city seemed to hold its breath as the broadcast began. The crackle of static gave way to a calm, distant voice, the Emperor's. Most had never heard it before. Some wept before the first sentence even finished. Others simply stared at the sky, trying to comprehend words that were both gentle and devastating. After pondering deeply the general trends of the world, the voice wavered slightly, as if it were speaking from another world entirely. Inside a quiet hospital ward, Lieutenant Sato stood among the wounded, a single radio placed on a crate beside a bed. Men with missing limbs, bandaged heads, and hollow eyes turned toward the sound, as though salvation might come from it. When the voice reached the phrase, "to effect a settlement of the present situation," a murmur spread through the room, confusion, disbelief, denial. But when the Emperor spoke of enduring the unendurable, the silence became absolute. Sato felt his chest tighten. He looked at the men around him, veterans who had fought in Burma, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, men who had watched friends die believing they would win. The word surrender was never spoken aloud in the broadcast, but everyone understood. The Empire had fallen. A sergeant with bandaged eyes began to cry. Another slammed his fist into the wall, shouting, "Lies! Americans forged that voice." A nurse tried to quiet him, but he collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. Sato switched off the radio. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. He walked to the window. The city outside looked strangely peaceful, as if Tokyo itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Yet beneath that stillness was an ache so deep it could not be spoken. Far away, in Hiroshima, Dr. Emiko Tanaka listened to the same voice through a damaged receiver salvaged from a wrecked car. Around her, survivors gathered in tattered clothes, their faces pale with burns and exhaustion. The broadcast faded in and out, words dissolving into static, but they caught enough to understand peace. The word rolled across the ruins, like wind through broken trees. One of the young soldiers, his arm in a makeshift sling, looked up at her. "Sensei, does it mean we lost?" Emiko's eyes filled. "No," she said softly. "It means we can stop dying." The boy nodded and stared at the horizon, where smoke still curled from distant fires. For the first time in years, no one was shooting, no planes droned overhead, and the city of ghosts stood still in fragile quiet. Back in Tokyo, General Anzai's funeral pyre burned on a small hill outside the capital. He had been buried quickly, before dawn, with no ceremony. Only Sato and 2 attendants had been present. They placed his sword beside him and whispered the Emperor's words over the grave. The flames flickered weakly, struggling against the morning drizzle. Sato bowed deeply. "You did what you could, sir. Japan lives because you chose truth over pride." When he rose, the sun had broken through a crack in the clouds, its light thin and uncertain. He turned toward the city, its smoke-stained roofs glimmering faintly. For the first time, he felt both sorrow and relief, 2 emotions that could coexist only in peace. The following days passed like a fever dream. American aircraft dropped leaflets instead of bombs, each one carrying instructions for surrender. Soldiers burned their flags, others bowed before shrines, asking forgiveness for surviving when their comrades had not. Entire families knelt in gardens, praying to ancestors they feared had abandoned them. At the palace, Emperor Hirohito met with his ministers once more. His face was gaunt but calm. "The people must rebuild," he said. "They will need guidance, not divinity. We must become human again." Togo bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, the Americans will demand trials. They will call you to account for the war." The emperor closed his eyes. "If it restores peace, I will bear their judgment. A ruler cannot hide behind the smoke of temples." Outside the palace walls, a group of officers who had participated in the failed coup were taken away quietly. Some begged for forgiveness. Others remained silent, eyes fixed on the horizon where the empire's banners had once flown. Major Hatanaka's body was found near the parade ground. He had shot himself hours after hearing the broadcast. A note lay beside him. "I only wish to die for honor." Sato read the note later and felt no triumph, only pity. The war had devoured everything: victory, defeat, and even the meaning of honor. Meanwhile, American troops prepared to land. Rumors spread through the city like wind through reeds, that the invaders would burn temples, take women, erase Japan's soul. Mothers wept. Fathers hid swords in floorboards. But when the first U.S. Marines stepped ashore in Yokohama weeks later, they came not with fire, but with cigarettes, chocolate, and cameras. Some Japanese bowed, others could not bring themselves to look. For Sato, watching from a rooftop, the sight was surreal. Foreign soldiers walking unchallenged through Tokyo's streets, something no samurai in history could have imagined. Yet there was no resistance. The people were too tired to hate. Down below, children chased a jeep as it rolled past, laughing at the novelty of it. The sound of laughter felt alien, like a language forgotten during the years of war. Sato smiled, despite himself. "Maybe this is what rebirth sounds like," he murmured. Dr. Emiko Tanaka was transferred to Tokyo by the occupying forces to assist in medical studies of radiation sickness. Her train passed through fields of blackened stumps where towns had once stood. At every station, people waited with hollow eyes, clutching whatever possessions had survived. When she reached the capital, she stepped into a world of contrasts: ruins beside neon lights powered by American generators, hunger beside sudden abundance. The hospital assigned to her was half collapsed, but she worked tirelessly, documenting symptoms no one had names for: hair falling in clumps, bleeding gums, fever that burned like poison. Western doctors visited, taking notes in English. She barely spoke to them, except to ask for supplies. One evening she looked out from the hospital window and saw American trucks rumbling past carrying food and medicine. The irony stung her. The same country that had destroyed Hiroshima now fed its survivors. Yet part of her whispered, "Perhaps this is mercy in disguise." At night, she dreamed of the flash, the blinding white that had erased everything she loved. In her dreams, she saw her city before the bomb. Paper lanterns floating on the river, laughter echoing from tea houses. When she woke, she would touch her scarred hands and remind herself she was still alive. That was all she could offer, the dead continuance. In September, Sato was summoned to meet with Allied officers to provide testimony about the coup attempt. The meeting took place in the former Army Ministry, now under American occupation. He entered a room where flags of two nations hung side by side, the rising sun folded beside the stars and stripes. The symbolism pierced him. An American colonel offered him a seat. "Lieutenant Sato, you were close to General Anzai, correct?" "Yes, sir," Sato replied in halting English. "You understand we need to know who ordered resistance after the surrender broadcast." "There were no orders," Sato said quietly. "Only ghosts who refused to die." The colonel studied him for a long moment. "You fought well," he said finally. "The world will remember your people's courage, but history will also remember the bombs." Sato met his eyes. "History will remember everything," he said. "That is its curse." After the interrogation, he walked through the courtyard where once officers had marched with pride. Now American jeeps idled there, their radios playing swing music. The sound drifted over the ruins, cheerful and cruelly alive. He realized, with a sudden ache, that Japan's silence would now carry foreign melodies. As months turned to winter, snow fell on Hiroshima for the first time since the bomb. Emiko stood in the ruins of the hospital, watching flakes settle on twisted steel. Children built tiny snow figures where shadows of bodies still marked the ground. She joined them, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. A small girl looked up at her. "Sensei, is this peace?" Emiko knelt, brushing the child's hair from her face. "Yes," she said after a long pause. "But peace can be heavy too." Far to the east, in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito prepared for his first public appearance as a mortal man. The divine aura that had shrouded him for generations was gone. When he stepped onto the balcony, thousands below fell to their knees, not out of worship, but from habit. He raised his hand, not in command, but in greeting. Cameras clicked, and for the first time, the world saw not a god, but a thin, solemn man who had survived the unthinkable. Lieutenant Sato stood among the crowd, his cap removed, his eyes fixed on the balcony. Around him, people wept openly, some calling out apologies, others prayers. Sato whispered under his breath, "Your voice ended a war, Majesty. May it also begin our humanity." Later, he walked through Ueno Park, where cherry trees had survived the bombings. Their bare branches reached upward, like bones against the sky. He imagined spring returning, blossoms covering scars, laughter returning to these paths. It would take years, maybe decades, but it would come. Life always did. That night, he dreamed of General Anzai again, the old soldier standing at the edge of a river, smiling faintly. Beyond him, cities glowed not with fire, but with morning light. Sato woke with tears on his face, unsure whether they were for the dead or for the living. Months later, Dr. Emiko Tanaka wrote in her medical report, "We measure radiation in numbers, but grief cannot be quantified. Yet amid decay, cells heal. Perhaps nations do too." She folded the paper, placed it inside her diary, and closed it. The sound of children laughing outside her window filled the room. In the end, the world moved forward, as it always does. The Americans left, the cities rose from rubble, and the scars of 2 suns faded into memory. But in quiet moments when the wind blew from the west and the air shimmered just so, some swore they could still feel the heat of August 6th and 9th, the days when the sky itself had spoken. For those who survived, peace was not an ending. It was a long, difficult beginning. A promise that life, however scarred, was still sacred. And so, Japan began to live again, not as an empire forged by war, but as a nation reborn from its own ashes. Winter gave way to spring in 1946, and Japan woke to the strange quiet of survival. The snow melted from the burned-out streets, uncovering a land caught between ruin and rebirth. Trains rattled again on twisted rails, rice paddies shimmered green, and from the ruins of Tokyo's alleys came the steady rhythm of hammers rebuilding, one plank at a time. Lieutenant Sato walked those streets daily, uniform traded for civilian clothes, his rank now meaningless in a country where the army itself had dissolved. He carried no sword, only a notebook in which he wrote names men he'd served with, families who'd lost everything, fragments of memory he couldn't let vanish. He rented a small room near Asakusa, its walls patched with newspaper, its window facing what had once been a Shinto shrine. The shrine's torii gate still stood, blackened but unbroken, a relic that refused to fall. Every morning, he watched the city stir. Women queued for water. Children scavenged for coal. Former soldiers traded metals for bread. The occupation authorities called it reconstruction, but for the people, it felt more like penance. Across town, Dr. Emiko Tanaka rose before dawn at the new university hospital, now partly funded by the Americans. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and despair. Rows of thin patients waited for treatment. Radiation sickness, malnutrition, tuberculosis. She had learned to mix compassion with efficiency. There was never enough time for both. One afternoon, she entered a ward where a young woman sat by the window, her hair falling out in strands. "Sensei," the patient whispered, "they say the Americans study our sickness because it was their bomb. Do you hate them?" Emiko paused. Outside, an American jeep rolled past the gate, its soldiers waving at the nurses. "Hate," she said slowly, "is a sickness too. It burns what it cannot heal." The girl smiled faintly. "Then you're curing more than bodies." That night, Emiko wrote in her journal, "Perhaps mercy is not the opposite of justice, but its evolution." Meanwhile, Emperor Hirohito lived behind the same palace walls, now stripped of divine titles. He met daily with General MacArthur, the tall American who towered like a monument in every photograph. To the public, their meetings symbolized defeat. To Hirohito, they were endurance, disguised as diplomacy. When he bowed to the general, cameras flashed. Some saw humiliation, others saw survival. Outside those walls, General Hideki Anzai's widow visited his unmarked grave every month. She carried incense and their son's photograph. Sato often joined her, standing silently beside the smoke that rose like prayers too shy for heaven. "He believed in the emperor until the end," she said once. "I hope the emperor believes in peace as much." Sato nodded. "He does, but peace is lonelier than war." Tokyo that spring was a city of ghosts learning to breathe again. The black markets thrived stalls selling stolen ration, rice, cigarettes, old military boots. On every corner, jazz music blared from American radios. Teenagers danced to it, laughing under neon signs powered by foreign wires. To the older generation, the rhythm sounded like surrender dressed in joy. To the young, it was the sound of tomorrow. One evening, Sato wandered into a small bar hidden in a bombed-out basement. The owner, a former Navy cook, served watered-down sake to soldiers and students alike. An American sergeant sat at the counter, showing photographs of his family to a group of curious locals. Sato watched him quietly. When the sergeant noticed his gaze, he raised his glass. "Peace," he said in halting Japanese. Sato hesitated, then raised his own. "Peace," he echoed. The word tasted unfamiliar, but not bitter. Afterward, he stepped into the street where rain had begun to fall, washing the dust from the pavements. He thought of Anzai, of the emperor, of Emiko, somewhere across the city tending wounds that no bandage could cover. Emiko, too, was fighting her own war. American scientists from the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission had arrived to study the survivors. They treated her kindly, offering equipment and funds, but their notebooks made her uneasy. Each patient was a specimen, not a person. One day, she confronted the chief researcher, Dr. Miller, a thin man with weary eyes. "You measure our suffering in data," she said, "but do you see their faces?" Miller removed his glasses. "Doctor, I see them every night. We're trying to understand so it never happens again." Emiko's anger softened. "Then promise me you'll remember their names, not just their numbers." "I will," he said quietly. "Will you?" She nodded, and for the first time since Hiroshima, she believed it might be true. Weeks later, she received a letter written in clumsy English from a soldier she had treated months before, now recovered and working in Osaka. "Because of you, I live," it read. "If someday you forget Hiroshima, remember me instead." She folded it carefully and placed it between the pages of her notebook. By midsummer, Tokyo's skyline began to change. Scaffolding rose where rubble had been. The sound of construction replaced the sirens of war. Street vendors sold American bread beside rice balls. Schoolchildren practiced new words: freedom, democracy, baseball. Sato found work as a translator for the Reconstruction Bureau. His English was broken but sufficient. He spent his days drafting reports and his nights walking the city's bridges, watching reflections of lanterns shimmer in the river. One evening, he saw two boys floating paper boats downstream, each carrying a candle. "For the dead?" he asked. "For everyone," one boy said. "My father says light helps souls find home." Sato watched the tiny flames drift away until they vanished. "Then maybe," he murmured, "the world is learning how to mourn." In August, On the first anniversary of Hiroshima, memorials were held across the country. Emiko stood before a crowd of survivors at Peace Park, the skeletal dome of the destroyed exhibition hall towering behind her. She read the names of her patients who had died that year. The air was heavy with incense and silence. When she finished, she looked up to find the crowd bowing deeply not to her but to each other, as if forgiveness could pass from one soul to another through the simple act of acknowledgement. That night, lanterns floated down the Motoyasu River, thousands of them, each a fragile prayer of light. Emiko released one of her own, whispering, "For those who endured." The current carried it gently away. Back in Tokyo, Sato listened to the ceremony on the radio. The announcer's voice trembled. "We remember the day the sun fell, so that it may never rise that way again." He closed his eyes and imagined Emiko's lantern among the others, its flame small but steady. Autumn brought rumors of new trials. The war criminals sat before Allied judges, faces expressionless as charges were read. Photographs of the trials appeared in every newspaper. Generals, ministers, men who once commanded armies, now reduced to defendants. Sato studied each image, wondering which of them truly felt remorse. When the sentence came for Anami's colleagues, he walked to the temple again and knelt before Anzai's grave. "They will hang some of them," he said softly. "Others will write memoirs pretending they never believed. But you faced truth before it was forced upon you." The wind rustled through the cemetery, carrying the smell of burning leaves. Emiko visited Tokyo that same week to deliver a medical report to the ministry. She and Sato met by chance at a tea house near Ueno. They hadn't seen each other since the surrender. She looked older but stronger, her hair cropped short, her hands still rough from endless work. "You survived," he said, surprised by the relief in his own voice. "So did you," she replied. They talked for hours of cities rebuilt, of patients healed, of ghosts that still lingered. When she spoke of Hiroshima, her voice softened. "Sometimes I think the city remembers even when we try to forget. The wind still smells of metal after rain." Sato nodded. Memory is the price of survival. Before they parted, she handed him a small paper crane. "For luck," she said. He smiled. "For peace." Months later, Sato visited Hiroshima himself. The train crossed bridges rebuilt from twisted steel. When he stepped onto the platform, the city looked both new and ancient. Children playing near the river, vendors selling fruit beside walls still charred. At Peace Park, he stood before the cenotaph where Emiko had spoken. The inscription read, "Let all the souls here rest in peace, for we shall not repeat the evil." He bowed deeply. As he turned to leave, he noticed an American family nearby. Tourists, perhaps. Their little girl pointed at the memorial and asked, "Daddy, what happened here?" The father knelt, searching for words. "A mistake," he said finally. "One we're still learning from." Sato walked away, tears stinging his eyes. He realized that perhaps learning was the only redemption humanity ever truly achieved. By 1948, the streets of Tokyo glowed with electric lights again. The scars of war faded into stories told to children who could not imagine hunger or firestorms. Yet every August, bells rang across the country, one for Hiroshima, one for Nagasaki, their tones deep and mournful, echoing across rivers and mountains. Dr. Emiko Tanaka continued her research, becoming one of Japan's first oncologists. Lieutenant Sato, now simply Mr. Sato, became a teacher, telling his students that courage was not the act of dying for one's country, but the strength to live for humanity. On the 10th anniversary of the war's end, they met again at Hiroshima Peace Park. The river glimmered under lantern light. 10 years, Sato said. "Do you think we've learned?" Emiko looked at the children running through the park, their laughter ringing clear. "We're still learning," she said, "but learning is life." The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of a bell from a distant temple. Sato closed his eyes. "The world forgot the names of our generals," he said, "but it remembers the light that fell. Maybe that's enough." Then, round for one stare. Emiko smiled gently. The light destroyed us once. Now it grows food, powers homes, lights, hospitals. We learned to turn death into energy. They stood together in silence as the lanterns floated past symbols of grief and grace entwined. For a moment, the river seemed to glow brighter than the sky. And above that quiet city, rebuilt from ashes and memory, dawn began again, soft, golden, and human. The year was 1965, 20 years since the sun had fallen. The world had changed beyond recognition. Tokyo was no longer the city of ghosts it once was. It pulsed with color, light, and noise. Neon signs glowed above streets crowded with cars and laughter. American jazz blended with Japanese folk melodies from open cafes. Children who had never seen war ran freely under the cherry blossoms, their laughter echoing down avenues once lined with rubble. Yet for those who had lived through the fire, the past remained like an old scar hidden beneath clothes but never forgotten. Lieutenant Sato, now Professor Sato, stood before a classroom of students at the University of Tokyo. The walls were clean and white, the air filled with the smell of chalk and rain. He was 61, his hair silver, his posture still straight despite age. On the blackboard behind him was written in neat Japanese script, "The weight of memory." He turned to the class. "History," he said, "is not a list of dates. It is the echo of choices." The students listened, notebooks open, pens poised. Many of them had only heard stories from their grandparents about the war. For them, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were paragraphs in textbooks. Tragic, yes, but distant. Sato picked up a small paper crane from his desk. Its folds yellowed with time. "This," he said softly, "was given to me by a doctor who survived Hiroshima. She told me it was for luck, but I think it was more than that. I think she meant for memory." A girl in the front row raised her hand. "Sensei, were you there? When the war ended?" Sato smiled faintly. "Yes, I heard the Emperor's voice with my own ears." "What did it sound like?" He paused, searching for words. Like forgiveness, spoken through sorrow. The sound of a god discovering he was human. The students wrote that down not as a fact, but as something truer than fact. After class, Sato walked home through Ueno Park. The air was filled with petals, each one drifting like a slow snowflake. He stopped by the pond, watching carp ripple beneath the surface. Every year around this time he came here, not to mourn, but to remember quietly. The ghosts no longer haunted him. They simply walked beside him in silence. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the paper crane. He had carried it for 2 decades, its edges worn smooth. Some things, he thought, should never be replaced. At the same hour, hundreds of kilometers away, Dr. Emiko Tanaka stood in the newly built Peace Memorial Hospital in Hiroshima. Her hair was streaked with gray now, her eyes lined but bright. She was overseeing the final tests for a new radiation therapy machine, a machine powered by the same nuclear energy that had once destroyed her city. The irony was not lost on her. A young intern approached her. "Sensei, the foreign delegation has arrived. They wish to see the unit." She nodded. "Tell them I'll be there shortly." Before leaving, she walked to the window overlooking the Peace Park. The cenotaph's arch framed the atomic dome perfectly, ruins and remembrance entwined. Beneath it, school children sang softly, "Let peace begin with me." Her heart tightened. She pressed her hand to the glass. "You see," she whispered, "we learned." In the lobby, the American delegation greeted her warmly. Among them was an elderly man with white hair and kind eyes. He introduced himself in fluent Japanese. "Dr. Tanaka, I don't expect you to remember me. My name is Robert Miller. We met in 1946. Emiko blinked in surprise. "Dr. Miller, the researcher?" He nodded, smiling gently. "I kept my promise. I remembered their names." Her throat tightened. "Then we both kept ours." They stood together in silence for a moment, 2 old witnesses from opposite sides of history, sharing the same fragile hope. Later that evening, after the delegation left, Emiko walked alone through the Peace Park. Lanterns floated down the river again, each one a small sun reborn in gentleness. She knelt by the water, whispering a prayer, not to gods but to time itself, that memory would never fade into indifference. Back in Tokyo, Professor Sato received a letter the same week. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. Inside was a photograph. Emiko standing by the river, smiling faintly, and a short note. "We have turned the weapon of death into a tool of healing. Perhaps that is how nations redeem themselves." He read it twice, then placed it beside the photo of General Anzai on his desk. The two images, the soldier and the doctor, seemed to balance each other like night and dawn. That night, he dreamed again of the War Council room, but it was empty now, no shouting, no smoke, only light pouring through shattered windows. In the dream, he saw Anzai standing by the map table, his uniform immaculate, his expression peaceful. "Did we do enough?" Sato asked. Anzai smiled faintly. "Enough to let others do better." When Sato woke, the city was quiet, except for the rustle of leaves. He sat by the window and watched the sunrise spread across Tokyo's skyline. It was not the harsh white of 1945, but a soft gold, like forgiveness taking shape. Days later, he boarded a train to Hiroshima. He hadn't been there in years. As the train wound through the countryside, he looked out at rice fields glistening under the sun, the same sun that had once burned everything it touched. Now it nurtured life again. When he arrived, the station was filled with music and laughter. Children sold origami cranes to tourists, their tiny hands folding paper faster than memory could unfold it. He bought one and placed it in his coat pocket beside Emiko's. He found her waiting by the Peace Park fountain. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "I wasn't sure either," he replied, smiling. "But something told me the story wasn't finished." They walked slowly through the park. Around them, survivors and their families laid flowers beneath the cenotaph. Emiko stopped near a stone engraved with thousands of names. "We add new ones every year," she said. Some were children during the blast. Others died much later, of what the radiation left behind. Sato touched the cold surface of the stone. "And you?" he asked softly. "Do you ever stop mourning?" She shook her head. "No, but mourning isn't always sorrow. Sometimes it's gratitude that we live to remember." They continued walking until they reached the river. The water sparkled, clear now, free of ashes. Emiko crouched and dipped her hand into it. "When I first saw this river," she said, "it was full of fire. I thought it would never run clean again. But look." Sato smiled. "Time purifies even the impossible." A bell rang in the distance, the same peace bell that tolled every year at exactly 8:15 a.m. The sound rolled gently across the city, deep and resonant, echoing against hills and hearts alike. Emiko closed her eyes. "For them," she whispered. Sato bowed his head. "For all of us." They stood there for a long while, two survivors of different battles bound by the same silence. When they finally turned to leave, the park was bathed in golden light. That evening, at a small cafe near the station, they sat together drinking tea. Outside, the streets buzzed with life. Teenagers in bright clothes, buses roaring, neon lights flickering. The future, loud and alive. Emiko looked out the window. "Do you ever think the world has truly learned?" Sato stirred his tea, watching the steam curl upward. "Learning never ends," he said. "But maybe remembering is the first lesson." She smiled. "Then we'll keep teaching it, won't we? Until our voices fade," he said. They clinked their cups gently together. Later that night, as the train carried Sato back toward Tokyo, he looked out at the dark fields sliding past, lit occasionally by distant farmhouses. He thought of Emiko, of the Emperor's trembling voice, of the countless faces he'd seen lost to history. The paper crane lay on his lap, glowing faintly under the carriage light. He whispered to himself, "We survived the fire so others could live in the light." When he reached Tokyo, dawn was breaking again, the 20-year anniversary of the surrender. Church bells, temple gongs, and factory whistles all sounded together, an accidental harmony that made the entire city pause. For a moment, it felt like the country itself was breathing as one. Professor Sato walked through Ueno Park once more. The cherry blossoms had begun to fall early, covering the ground like pink snow. He sat on a bench and unfolded Emiko's letter, reading it again under the morning light. Around him, children played, their laughter high and pure. He smiled faintly. "Yes," he said aloud, "perhaps that is how nations redeem themselves." He folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his notebook, and watched the children run past free, unburdened, unaware of the ghosts that had built their peace. And for the first time, he felt that forgetting, too, might be part of healing. The wind rose, scattering petals into the air. They swirled upward, catching the sun, and for an instant, the entire park shimmered like a living painting. In that moment, the war truly ended, and the world moved on, not by erasing what happened, but by carrying it forward in quiet hearts, in folded paper cranes, in the soft ringing of a bell that promised never again.